Hi, I'm Jeff Murron, and I want to welcome you to True Texas History. Today, I'm going to be dealing with James Power by special request. A reader went ahead and wanted to know more about him, was having difficulty finding much. And he's a good person for each of us to be aware of. I guess to start off with, he was a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. And each of those people would be good to know something about. Well, James Power was born in Ballygarrett, Ireland in 1788. And what you need to know about that, it's in Ireland. This was the epicenter of the 1798 uprisings in Ireland. And so as a young boy, he saw a lot of unrest, a lot of political upheaval, and a lot of dead bodies. In my mind, it was probably a traumatizing type of experience that stayed with him the rest of his life. But it also means that he definitely had a love of Ireland and the Irish people. And as typical, when there's unrest in one country, people tend to move on to another. And he found himself in 1809 in New Orleans. And while there in New Orleans, he met with Stephen F. Austin. And Austin, this young lawyer, was full of ideas. And one of the ideas that he was presenting was the whole idea of bringing colonists to Texas. He thought it was a good idea. His dad had worked on it. Now he was taking over. And James Power thought it was a good idea, and he went ahead and joined in. And so in a few years, he found his way. He went with Stephen F. Austin into Texas, was part of some of the early negotiations. In 1821, he finally entered Mexico and Matamoros. Got involved in some early ventures, some mining ventures, and that's when he met a fellow by the last name of Hewitson, that he went into partnership originally for some mining operations, but the two eventually partnered up to submit their application for an impresario contract. Now, Hewitson was also Irish, but an Irish doctor, about 10 years his junior. In 1823, Powers became a citizen of Mexico, and he also managed to obtain an impresario contract. Now, an impresario contract, it gave him a lot of land. Of course, he had the responsibilities of bringing in settlers, but also he was responsible for raising a militia. That didn't seem to be that big a deal in the 1820s, but come the mid-1830s, it became a touchy issue. And he initially came in, they were given land between the Lavaca and the Guadalupe rivers down in the river bottoms. And there's definitely some rich land down there if you've ever been down to that part of Texas. And as he was settling, from time to time he got involved with political squabbles, mainly with Viramundi, who was operating as governor at one point. With Viscasa, he had the problems with Manana. He was always putting him off and foot dragging, and but he still managed to get his colonists here. Now, in the early days of unrest, he was involved in the action at Fort La Pan and saw some action there. And I'll resume it. And then in 1834, he went back to Ireland, went campaigning to get some more colonists, and managed to get some more colonists. But when they arrived in New Orleans, he had a problem because New Orleans was under quarantine with a cholera epidemic. we talk about the concern with quarantines. That was routine in Texas, whether it be cholera or yellow fever, which they often call yellow jack. That happened quite often. I may have to do a special episode on that because, back when Houston and Galveston were competing to see what was going to be the #1 city in Texas, it was only because of a yellow fever epidemic where Galveston was under quarantine that Houston took all the rail traffic and shot ahead and became the #1 city in Texas. So pandemics have definitely been a big part of Texas history, and the yellow fever pandemic was one of them. And this discouraged some of the settlers, but they stuck with him, and he managed to, they left New Orleans, and he made his way to Texas, and they settled them. Had some hardships along the way, had to ask the governor for help. That was in 1834. Then come 1835, the unrest was continuing, and it would put the impresarios in a tough spot. And this is where, because he had the militia, the Texans kept wanting him to commit to the call for independence, and he was kind of putting it off. And at one point, he had a meeting with Coss in late 1835. He said, "I wish you hadn't come here," referring to Mexican military presence, because he knew nothing good was going to come of it. Shortly after that, Coss went to San Antonio, was involved in the siege of Bear, kicked out, and then we had the whole episode of Texas independence. Now, I mention this because in 1836, James Power was one of the delegates to the Washington on the Brazos meeting. Not only did he sign the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, he was also campaigned actively to seat Sam Houston. Because keep in mind, Sam Houston was not the favorite of a lot of people. Nowadays, the way history books write it, you think that he was a shoo-in. No, there was some people that really didn't like him. And in fact, his home county would not send him as a delegate. He went independent, and there were some people that were suspicious that he was nothing more than an American agent sent by Andrew Jackson down here to stir up trouble. And they were suspicious because they wanted a free and independent Texas, separate from the U.S. But James Power was involved with that, and he was away during this time, and that's one reason why when General Urrea was coming up the Texas coast, imposing a threat to the colonists, including his, because keep in mind, you had a lot of Irishmen there, and the Mexican government liked the Irish because they weren't Americans, and they were already Catholic, and they figured it would be easier for them to assimilate. But when Santa Anna's troops were coming along and doing their share of atrocities and burning people out of their farms and so forth, those were the settlers that wanted help there at Refugio. They were members of his colony, and one of the members of his colony was the one that rode to Goliad and asked Fannin for help, and Fannin sent help. And I talked about the Battle of Refugio yesterday, but they didn't end up well. But that's why they appealed to Fannin, because James Power was the head of the colony and the head of the local militia, because as the impresario he got to be that, was away at Washington on the Brazos and was not there to help. But he did support the Texas cause, fortunately, and he ended up passing away. Well, in 1837, he opened a mercantile in Aransas City, became a businessman, and later on died in 1852. Now, because of his colonization efforts, we find the city of Refugio is twinned with Ballygarrett there in Ireland, the city that he came from. So even nowadays, there is a union of the two. Now, one thing we need to remember, and especially with St. Patrick's Day coming up, we need to remember the contribution of the Irish. Whether or not you realize that 100 of Sam Houston's 910 men were born in Ireland. And that's more than 1/10 of his force was Irish. And 15 Irishmen died at the Alamo and 14 at Goliad. And we need to remember, because too many times we think it was just people from the East Coast. No. There were people from many nations, but Ireland was definitely one of them, and I need to make you aware of it. So I went ahead and covered James Power. He definitely did more than this, but this will give you a little bit of background of this signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. I give you a little more background on what was going on in Refugio and what these Irishmen were doing down there. That's, of course, still to this day, that's why you have San Patricio County for St. Patrick. So hope you all have a great weekend. And until next time, this is Jeff Murrah wishing you Vaya con Dios, my friend.